My parents forced me to buy my own food at 14, then tried charging me rent at 15, after spending all their money on themselves. The first time I realized my parents weren't really acting like parents was over a missing lunch. I was 13, standing in the kitchen before school, waiting for my mom to hand me something to eat like she usually did. But the counter was empty. No bread, no peanut butter, nothing packed, nothing prepared. Mom was already at the table drinking coffee from a cafe cup, scrolling on her phone like it was just another normal morning. I hesitated before speaking. Did we run out of lunch stuff? She didn't even look up. You're 13 now, she said casually. You can start buying your own lunches. I thought she was joking. When I didn't respond, she sighed like I was being difficult. We're teaching you responsibility. Kids your age work. From the living room, Dad nodded without looking away from the new giant TV they had just bought. Nothing wrong with learning how to handle yourself, he said. I stood there still holding my backpack, waiting for someone to laugh or correct it. Nobody did. Behind me, the pantry was full of snacks they bought for themselves. The fridge in the garage had drinks just for them. Packages from online orders kept arriving almost every week. But suddenly I couldn't even get a school lunch. That same month, school supplies stopped too. When I asked for notebooks, Mom handed me a small amount of cash and told me to make it work. It didn't even cover everything. So I started borrowing pens, skipping pages, pretending I forgot things at home. One day, a teacher quietly slid a notebook onto my desk after class without saying anything. I just stared at it. I couldn't even say thank you properly. At home, nothing changed for them. Dad upgraded the sports package. Mom kept ordering skincare boxes. They went out to eat while I stayed home eating instant noodles. Then Dad started calling it funny. Our little entrepreneur, he'd say when I came home tired from walking dogs or babysitting. At first I thought it was a phase, but it wasn't. It became normal. By 14, I was buying almost everything myself. Food, toiletries, school supplies, even clothes from thrift stores. They called it learning independence. But it didn't feel like independence. It felt like being forgotten while still living in the same house. And that was the moment I started realizing something I couldn't unsee. I wasn't being taught responsibility. I was being left to handle everything alone. The older I got, the worse it became. At 13, it was lunches and school supplies. By 14, they had almost completely stopped buying food for me. I'd come home starving after school, open the fridge, and realize everything inside belonged to them. Dad's drinks had his name written on them. Mom started labeling leftovers so I wouldn't touch them. One night, they brought home burgers and fries from a restaurant I loved. The smell filled the kitchen while I stood there pretending not to notice. Mom glanced at me. There's ramen in the cabinet. That was it. No guilt, no hesitation. Used to ramen. After a while, things that should feel shocking start feeling normal. I stopped asking for food because every conversation became a lecture. You have your own money. We're teaching you responsibility. This is how people learn independence. Meanwhile, they kept spending money constantly. Dad bought golf equipment. Mom ordered skincare and makeup online almost every week. They talked about budgeting while wasting money faster than anyone I knew. But somehow I was the financial problem. So I worked more, dog walking after school, babysitting on weekends, lawn work during the summer. By 15, I had regular clients around the neighborhood and almost no free time left. The strange part was that I became better with money than my parents ever were. I tracked every dollar carefully. I planned meals around sales. I compared prices before buying basic things like shampoo or detergent. While they impulse bought expensive junk, I learned how to survive on almost nothing. But they still mocked me for looking poor. Mom once stared at my thrift store shoes before a family gathering. You seriously couldn't find something less embarrassing? I looked down at the shoes I bought myself and felt my face burn. Dad complained to relatives about how expensive teenagers were, while I sat there knowing they hadn't bought me clothes in years. Then everything changed. Dad lost his job. At first, he acted calm about it. He kept saying another company would hire him quickly. But weeks passed. Then months. The house slowly became tense all the time. The restaurant dinners stopped. The shopping slowed down. And suddenly my parents became very interested in my money. One evening, Mom cornered me in the kitchen while I counted cash from a lawn job. We're struggling right now, she said carefully. We might need a little help. I just stared at her. Because all I could think about were the nights I sat upstairs hungry while they ate takeout downstairs. Dad walked in a second later and looked directly at the money in my hand. You've got savings, he said. Family helps family. That sentence almost made me laugh. because apparently family only mattered once they needed something from me. At first, they called it borrowing. Mom would ask if I could cover groceries just this once. Dad said they only needed help until he found another job. But just this once turned into every week. Then every few days. Every conversation somehow circled back to my savings. Dad started asking how much money I had left. Mom kept reminding me that I lived in their house for free. That phrase made my stomach twist every time she said it, because nothing about living there felt free. I paid for my own food, my own clothes, my own school supplies, sometimes even my own soap and toothpaste. The only thing they technically provided was a roof. And they never let me forget it. One night, Dad sat across from me at the kitchen table while I worked on homework. "You know," he said casually, "most kids your age would want to help their parents." I kept my eyes on my notebook. I already helped myself. His expression hardened immediately. That attitude is exactly the problem. I wanted to ask what problem he meant. The part where I'd been financially supporting myself since middle school? Or the part where they suddenly cared about family after running out of money? But arguing never helped. It only made things worse. So I stayed quiet. That silence seemed to irritate him even more. A few days later, I came home after mowing 3 lawns in 90-degree heat. I was exhausted, sweaty, and starving. The house smelled like pizza. For one stupid second, I thought maybe they bought enough for me too. Then I walked into the kitchen and saw only 2 plates. Dad looked up from the couch. "There's cereal if you're hungry." Something inside me almost snapped right there. Because they were still spending money on themselves while asking me for financial help. They still acted like my needs were optional. That night, I sat in my room eating dry cereal from a plastic cup while trying to calculate how long my savings would last if things got worse. I had around $2,000 saved. Not because I was rich. Because I was terrified. Terrified of emergencies. Terrified of needing something I couldn't afford. Terrified that one day they'd decide even the roof over my head wasn't free anymore. 3 weeks later, that fear became real. I walked into the kitchen after school and immediately knew something was wrong. Both my parents were sitting at the table waiting for me. Dad had papers spread out in front of him. Mom folded her hands together tightly. "We've been talking," she said carefully, "and it's time for you to start contributing to household expenses." My chest tightened instantly. Dad slid the papers toward me. It was a contract. $500 a month, plus utilities. Or I could find somewhere else to live. For a second, I honestly thought it was a joke. I stared at the contract waiting for one of them to laugh. Nobody did. Dad pushed a pen across the table. "You're making decent money now," he said. "It's only fair." Fair. That word kept echoing in my head while I looked at the numbers again. $500 a month plus utilities would wipe out almost everything I earned. There would barely be enough left for food, gas for my mower, school supplies, or emergencies. Mom crossed her arms. "You need to start acting like an adult." I almost laughed at that too, because they'd been treating me like an adult since I was 13. Only now they wanted me to financially support them too. "I need time to think about it," I said quietly. Dad's face darkened immediately. "What's there to think about?" I grabbed the contract and went to my room before the argument could explode. The second the door locked behind me, my hands started shaking. I spread my budget notebook across the bed and started doing the math over and over again. Every version ended the same way. Disaster. If I paid them what they wanted, my savings would disappear within months. One bad week, one broken mower, one emergency, and I'd have nothing left. That night I barely slept. I stayed awake searching online to see whether parents could legally charge rent to a minor. The answers were confusing. Some people said yes. Others said parents were still legally required to provide food, clothing, and necessities until 18. I started screenshotting everything. Articles, legal forums, state guidelines, anything that sounded important. Around 2 in the morning, I found a legal aid website explaining parental obligations toward minors. I read the same paragraph 3 times. Parents are responsible for providing basic support, including food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and education. My stomach twisted, because my parents had stopped providing most of that years ago. The next morning, I told them I wasn't signing anything until I talked to someone at school first. Dad exploded instantly. "You're unbelievable," he snapped. Mom joined in before I could answer. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" Everything we've done for you. That sentence made me so angry I could barely breathe. Dad slammed his coffee mug onto the counter hard enough for coffee to splash everywhere. "You live here for free," he yelled. You should be grateful. I grabbed my backpack before things got worse. Behind me, I could still hear him shouting as I walked out the front door. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped my bike lock. The ride to school felt like a blur. By lunchtime, I still couldn't focus on anything. Finally, I walked to the counseling office. The secretary asked if I had an appointment. I told her it was important. 5 minutes later, the school counselor opened the door and quietly invited me inside. The second she asked if everything was okay at home, I almost broke down. Her office smelled like coffee and old books. There were plants near the window and little motivational posters on the wall that normally would have felt cheesy. But that day they made the room feel strangely safe. She asked me to start from the beginning. So I did. At first I only planned to explain the rent contract. But once I started talking, everything came out. The lunches. The missing school supplies. Buying my own food at 14. The locked pantry. Working jobs after school just to survive while my parents ordered takeout downstairs. She didn't interrupt me once. She just listened quietly while writing things down. When I finally stopped talking, the room felt painfully silent. Then she asked something nobody had ever asked me before. Do you feel taken care of at home? The question hit me harder than I expected, because I honestly didn't know how to answer it. Physically, yes. I had a roof over my head. But emotionally? Financially? Not even close. I shook my head slowly. Her expression changed immediately. More serious. More careful. She explained that she wasn't a lawyer, but parents were legally required to provide necessities for their minor children. Food, clothing, basic care. Charging rent while refusing those things could become a serious issue. Hearing another adult say it out loud made something shift inside me. For years, my parents acted like I was dramatic or selfish for struggling. Now someone was finally confirming that what they were doing wasn't normal. She asked if I'd be willing to speak with free legal aid. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. While she stepped outside to make a phone call, I sat there staring at my hands, trying not to cry. Not because I was weak, because I was exhausted. Exhausted from handling everything alone for years. When she came back, she smiled gently. They'll call within a day or two, she said. Then she helped me apply for free school lunches. I almost felt embarrassed filling out the forms. She noticed immediately. There's nothing shameful about needing help, she said softly. That nearly broke me more than anything else, because my parents had spent years making me feel guilty for having needs at all. Before I left, she told me to keep documenting everything. Texts, photos, receipts, anything connected to money or food. So I started paying closer attention. I took pictures of the locked pantry, screenshots of food delivery orders, photos of empty shelves beside my parents' takeout containers. I even photographed the rent contract. 2 days later, legal aid called. The meeting was scheduled after school downtown. The entire bus ride there, my stomach twisted with anxiety. Part of me still felt guilty. Like I was betraying my parents somehow. But another part of me kept remembering all those nights I sat upstairs hungry while they laughed downstairs over restaurant food. And that part was finally starting to feel angry instead of ashamed. The lawyer's office was smaller than I expected. Boxes of files were stacked against the walls and papers covered almost every surface. The man who introduced himself as Boyd looked tired but kind. He asked me to sit down and tell him everything from the beginning. So I did. The lunches, the jobs, the food situation, the rent contract. Every time I thought part of the story sounded ridiculous out loud, Boyd only looked more serious. When I explained my parents stopped buying food regularly years earlier, he actually stopped writing. They stopped feeding you consistently at 14? He asked carefully. I nodded. Then he started asking detailed questions. Who bought toiletries? Who paid for clothes? Who paid for school supplies? I answered honestly. Mostly me. Sometimes teachers quietly helped. Sometimes neighbors gave me food without making a big deal out of it. Boyd wrote everything down. Then he asked the question that made my stomach tighten. Do you have proof? For the next 10 minutes, I showed him everything saved on my phone. Photos of the locked pantry, screenshots of takeout receipts, pictures of empty cabinets, the rent contract, even my budgeting notebook with every dollar tracked carefully. By the time he finished reading, his jaw looked tight with frustration. This documentation is very good, he said finally. Good. I hated that word in that moment because it meant things were serious enough to need evidence. Boyd explained parents were legally required to provide necessities for their minor children. Charging rent while refusing support could absolutely raise neglect concerns. He said he could send a formal letter outlining their responsibilities and warning them against forcing me into an unfair agreement. Would that make things worse? I asked quietly. Possibly, he admitted, but it also gives you protection. Protection. That word hit harder than I expected because I'd never really felt protected before. Before I left, Boyd handed me his direct number. If things escalate, call immediately, he said. That evening, I came home carrying leftovers Boyd bought me after the meeting. It was the first time in years an adult had bought me food without making me feel guilty for it. The second I walked inside, both my parents looked up. Dad noticed the folder immediately. What's that? I took a breath. I met with legal aid. The silence afterward felt dangerous. Dad stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. You talked to a lawyer? He snapped. I wanted to understand my rights. Dad instantly started yelling about disrespect and betrayal, while Mom cried beside him saying she couldn't believe I'd do this to the family. But for once their guilt tactics didn't work the same way anymore. Because deep down I finally understood something. Parents who are doing the right thing usually don't panic when lawyers get involved. After that night, the house changed completely. My parents stopped yelling as much. Instead, everything became quiet in this cold, tense way that made me feel nervous every second I was home. Mom barely spoke to me unless she absolutely had to. Dad watched me constantly. If I left my backpack in the living room for 5 minutes, it suddenly appeared outside my bedroom door. If I bought groceries with my own money, Mom would stare at the bags without saying anything. Even dinner felt different. They still ordered takeout constantly, but now they ate in silence while the television played in the background. No one invited me to sit down. Not that they ever really had before. I usually stayed upstairs until I heard the containers hit the trash. At school, Miss Gilmore started checking on me every day during lunch. Sometimes she only talked to me for a few minutes. Other times, she helped me catch up on missing assignments because my grades had started slipping from stress. One afternoon, she printed out a schedule balancing school, homework, work hours, and sleep. Looking at it made me realize how insane my life had become. Most kids my age worried about tests or dating. I worried about groceries and legal rights. One Friday after school, I was putting my mower back into Eliana's garage when she walked outside carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. You're working too hard, she said gently. I shrugged like it wasn't a big deal. Eliana leaned against the garage doorway, watching me quietly for a second. You can keep your equipment here permanently if you want, she said. I blinked at her. What? My garage, she explained. It's safer here. The fact she already understood scared me a little. I tried giving a vague explanation about financial stress, but Eliana just nodded slowly, like she could hear everything I wasn't saying. Then she said something that stayed in my head the rest of the night. Sometimes adults fail their children long before the children realize it. I didn't know how to respond to that. So I just thanked her quietly and pushed my mower deeper into the garage. That weekend, she gave me extra yard work and paid me early. When she handed me the money, her voice lowered carefully. And if things ever become too much at home, she said softly, my guest room is available. I stared at her for a second, because suddenly this situation felt terrifyingly real. Like other adults were starting to realize I might actually need somewhere else to go. A few days later, things at home got worse in quieter ways. Not screaming. Not threats. Just small, cruel things done slowly on purpose. Mom put a lock on the pantry. Dad started labeling shelves in the refrigerator with black marker. Do not touch. At first, they claimed it was about budgeting. But it became obvious the rules were mostly for me. One afternoon, I came home after mowing lawns for hours in the heat. I was starving. The kitchen smelled like garlic bread and takeout pasta.
Dad sat at the table scrolling through his phone while Mom packed leftovers into containers.
I opened the fridge carefully. Almost everything inside had their names written on it. I reached for a yogurt without thinking. Mom looked over immediately. That's not yours. I froze. It's one yogurt, I said quietly. We're trying to make food last, she replied coldly. Dad didn't even look up from his phone. Slowly, I put the yogurt back. Then I noticed an entire shelf full of untouched restaurant leftovers behind the labeled containers. Enough food for days, but somehow they still acted like I was stealing from them. I grabbed a bottle of water instead and headed upstairs. Right before I reached the stairs, Dad finally spoke. Most teenagers help their families instead of threatening them with lawyers. I stopped walking. I didn't threaten anybody. You embarrassed us, he muttered. That word hit harder than I expected. Embarrassed. Like I was the problem. Like I was ruining this family. I went upstairs without answering because I knew if I started talking, years of anger would come pouring out all at once.
Later that night, I sat on my bedroom floor eating instant oatmeal made with hot water from my bathroom sink. The house stayed quiet except for muffled voices downstairs. At first, I ignored them. Then I heard Dad say something that made my entire body go still. "She's hiding money from us," Mom answered immediately. "Then take the mower." Silence. My stomach dropped. "She can't work without it," Mom snapped. I stopped breathing for a second. They were actually planning this. Not helping me. Strategizing against me. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and texted Eliana immediately. "Are you awake?" The reply came less than a minute later. "Yes, what happened?" I swallowed hard before typing back. "I think my parents want to take my equipment." 3 dots appeared instantly. "Bring everything to my garage tomorrow morning before school." Then another message appeared underneath it. "And sweetheart, you do not deserve any of this." That text hit harder than anything else all week. Because for years I'd convinced myself maybe I deserved some of it. Maybe I really was selfish. But sitting there alone eating oatmeal while my parents planned how to destroy the only thing keeping me afloat. I finally understood something. Good parents don't see their children as enemies.
The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For a few seconds, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence in the house. Then I remembered the conversation from the night before. The mower. My equipment. Everything I'd spent years building. I moved fast after that. I quietly carried my tools out through the side door one trip at a time while my parents slept upstairs. Every sound made my heart race. The mower wheels rattled softly against the driveway as I pushed it toward Eliana's garage across the street. When I reached her house, the garage door was already open. Eliana stood inside wearing sweatpants and holding a cup of coffee. She didn't ask questions. She just helped me move everything inside. When we finished, she looked at me carefully. "You've been surviving on your own for a long time, haven't you?" That question almost broke me, because surviving was exactly what it felt like. Not living, not growing up, just surviving. That afternoon, I came home from school and immediately knew something had happened. Both my parents were waiting in the kitchen. Dad's face was red. "Where's the mower?" he demanded. I set my backpack down slowly. "What mower?" "The one you moved this morning," Mom snapped. So they had been watching. I felt strangely calm suddenly. "It's somewhere safe," I answered. Dad slammed his hand against the counter. "You have no right hiding property from us in our own house." "Property. Not mine. Even after I paid for it myself. Even after years of work." I looked directly at him. "You mean the equipment I bought with money I earned because you stopped supporting me?" The silence afterward felt heavy. Mom looked furious. Dad looked embarrassed. For the first time, neither of them had an answer ready. A few days later, Boyd contacted Child Protective Services after I updated him about the pantry lock and the threats toward my business equipment. Everything happened fast after that. Caseworkers came to the house. Teachers were interviewed. Neighbors talked. And suddenly my parents couldn't control the story anymore. By the end of the month, I was temporarily staying with Eliana while everything got sorted out legally. The weirdest part was how different life felt in her house. She bought groceries without acting resentful about it. She asked if I'd eaten dinner. She reminded me to get enough sleep. The first night there, she knocked softly on the guest room door and handed me an extra blanket because the weather had turned colder. That tiny gesture almost made me cry harder than all the fighting ever had. Because I realized something sitting there in that quiet room. Love isn't supposed to feel like survival. Years later, my parents still tell people they were just trying to teach me responsibility. But responsibility wasn't what they taught me. They taught me what happens when children are forced to become adults too early. And they taught me exactly the kind of parent I never want to become.